More than education, training, and experience, a person's level of resiliency is what often determines who succeeds and who fails. The inter-office dynamics at work is an ongoing challenge, and employees and managers are feeling the pain. Whether you own a family business or work for a Fortune 500 company, resiliency is truly the X factor. So take a coffee break and come join us for another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we like to simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. So welcome to another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. And today we're going to be talking about how conflict management oftentimes plays both a positive and a challenging role towards driving resiliency within organizations. So Dr. Keith, welcome. We're excited for yet another exciting podcast.
Looking forward to it.
So conflict, as we know, can take on many different forms and have many different outcomes. Many times, I think we've seen that conflict can be a dynamic force that actually moves conflicting parties in an organization towards a more productive reality. But there's also times, Dr. Keith, that you and I know that conflict can be very devastating. And as long as there's people that are trying to coexist, conflict is absolutely inevitable. Now, having differentiating values and beliefs and opinions, to me, what I've seen in the workplace firsthand, oftentimes is the perfect setup for misunderstandings, which eventually leads to conflict. So, Dr. Keith, what do you think makes conflict positive or negative?
Well, Matt, it really begins with a good understanding of the definition of conflict. The definition that we use often is that conflict is just a difference of an opinion.
I guess with that definition in mind, I can see how conflict could be positive. For example, conflict could create a constructive level of tension, although I'm going to challenge you, Dr. Keith, that I'm still not convinced, and I'm not sure our listeners are convinced, that there is such thing as positive conflict.
Well, again, first of all, your example of constructive level of tension is absolutely true. You know, and as two people try to resolve or manage a conflict, it can oftentimes strengthen the relationships. I mean, haven't you in your life, professionally and or personally, worked through a conflict with somebody and it brought you closer together?
Without a doubt. I do see that in the workplace, and I see that outside of the workplace as well, is that getting into a conflict and working through that conflict is not necessarily a fun or great place to be, but once you and those other parties come through that, you can oftentimes look back as a sense of appreciation and understanding of what you went through.
Absolutely.
So why, though, do so many people dislike conflict, even at times doing everything they can to absolutely avoid it?
Let me answer that question with a question for you. Who do you believe is the greatest basketball player ever to play the game?
Outside of myself?
Yeah, outside of you and I, right.
All right. That, to me, is a no-brainer. I'm going to say it's MJ, Michael Jordan.
No, I say it's LeBron James. I think he's better. So, right now, what's happening? We are in a conflict based on our definition. You have one opinion, I have a different opinion. Now, is there anything wrong with that emotionally? Anything going on? I mean, is it good, bad, or just we're different right now?
Well, different, and I may slide in the word uncomfortable at times when you're getting into conflict.
Okay, so here's what happens as we look at the anatomy of it. You try to convince me why Jordan's better than James. I'm not budging. I try to convince you why James is better than Jordan. You're not budging. Now you're trying to convince me more so, and I'm trying to convince you, and our emotions are rising, our stress levels are rising, and then finally we get so angry and so frustrated with one another. It's the emotional turmoil that people dislike in conflict.
Yeah, you were getting worked up. I was going to tell you, hey, take it easy. It's just Michael Jordan and LeBron James.
I was ready to challenge you with one-on-one, you know?
So I'll take you on the court afterwards. But so there must be other factors that truly kind of block people's ability to resolve and manage through conflict. Like you were stating there, oftentimes the challenges are the blockers that get in the way of the ability to work through that.
There are several, Matt. Things like our ego, or poor communication, or people's styles.
So when you say people's style, tell us a little bit more about that.
Let me say it a little differently. When you're trying to work through a conflict, there are effective ways and basically ineffective ways to respond, or what I call our response styles.
All right. So, what would be some ineffective ways to approach things?
And you've seen this. I've seen it. People have to win at all costs, or display a great deal of anger, yelling and screaming, demeaning somebody, being sarcastic, or just avoidance.
Is it fair to say, Dr. Keith, though, that when you talk about that, there's some people that absolutely feel like they have to win at all costs, that they almost seek that conflict out, they almost thrive on it? It's the air in which they breathe?
Yeah, when people who are that highly competitive to win at all costs, I mean, they have to win, and they'll do anything to win. You see it in business negotiations, where some people come in and they have to win. You see it in sports. From everyday recreational players to every level of sports, and to win at all costs. I mean, there's a new movie coming out with Tanya Harding and the other skater,
Nancy Kerrigan.
Thank you. And what does she do? She, not she, but some of her entourage or whatever, clubbed Nancy, to win the Olympics.
We're not going to see that in the workplace. That will give us a whole different podcast. But I think what we see is that conflict not only sees its way in obvious places such as sports, but we also see how it can have significant impacts in the workplace as well. I know personally I've experienced these types of responses within conflict, and it really ticks me off. So, as we oftentimes do, we look for ways in which we can find solutions, practical ways in which we can go about handling conflict in the workplace. For this example, what are some better ways we could respond as individuals?
So some more effective ways would be one technique that I think is phenomenal is called taking the perspective taking. Perspective taking simply is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Now, once I understand who you are, what you really want, what you really need, then we're moving closer together. And if you can take my perspective and better understand me, again, see the movement, we're coming closer together. And again, taking perspective doesn't mean you agree with the person. It just means you understand them much better.
So why don't we talk about the next one then, reflective thinking, I think you mentioned. Tell us a little bit more about
reflective thinking is just examining the pros and the cons, the good, the bad, is what is meant by reflective thinking. Expressing your emotions appropriately is another one. I mean, come on. I mean, you've seen it. I've seen it in the workplace where there are some people who will yell, scream, and really go after somebody verbally is inappropriate. You just don't do that. But I can tell you in an appropriate way, Matt, I got to tell you, I'm really upset what happened in that meeting last week. And it really bothered me, and I just want you to know that. That's an appropriate communication.
So I think oftentimes what I see in the workplace is that people get what I oftentimes refer to as their buttons pressed, that they have these hot buttons that get pressed and triggered, and away they go. In your work and your experience, are those hot buttons out there? And if so, how do you go about avoiding those triggers?
Well, you do. We all have them, Matt. Come on. I know I have several hot buttons that just really quickly triggers that negative, visceral response to a situation. And I'm sure you do too. I mean, what are some of your hot buttons, Matt?
Well, for me personally, I know if somebody questions the quality of my work, that immediately sets me off because I personally feel that they are questioning my ability to do my job and do it well.
Oh yeah, and mine, someone who questions me, someone who the know-it-alls out there, they know everything, or someone who is highly abrasive, someone who is, they're toxic in their communication, the arrogance. These are my hot buttons. I have trouble with people or those types of situations. Those are just what we call our hot buttons, and we all have them.
So I think we have laid the groundwork for all intensive purposes of conflict and the challenge that conflict can have in the workplace and helping both individuals and those organizations be as resilient as possible. When we come back from break, I'd like to explore a little further what are some of the things that we can do to better manage and resolve conflict. While we talked about perspective taking and reflective thinking and learning to better express our emotions, I'm going to take a hunch that we'll have some other practical tips and techniques that we can apply to truly making managing conflict in the workplace something that we can yet turn into a success. So we're glad to come back from our break here on the Resiliency X Factor, simply as we call it RX. And we're spending our podcast today really talking about conflict management and how the ability to effectively work through and manage through conflict in the workplace allows us and the organizations that we work for become all the more resilient. So when we came back from break now, we're talking about what are the practical tips and techniques we can use to help resolve conflict. And while on our pre-break, we kind of set the stage for what conflict is and some initial tips, now I think we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. Right, Dr. Keith?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So go ahead and kind of get us started with what you think are some of the best techniques that we could use to better manage through and resolve conflict.
Let me first start off by giving our listeners and you a metaphor. And if you think of yourself as a tree, just picture ourselves as a tree.
Any tree, weeping willow, maple,
yeah, any
walnut.
tree, man. Yeah, any tree. And the deep-rooted part of the tree.
Bonsai tree.
The deep-rooted part of the tree lies our core beliefs. That's the underneath the tree, rooted. And these beliefs become internalized by the person and then becomes our values, which is now the trunk of our tree. It creates our values. And our values and our beliefs together and our other experiences make up our opinions, which is the branch level of the tree. And as defined earlier, I said conflict occurs when our opinions clash. Unfortunately, many people try to resolve conflict at the branch levels rather than understanding the person's core beliefs and values. Consequently, they remain stuck and the conflict remains unresolved. So the key is to understand each other's core beliefs.
All right, so it's an interesting metaphor. I can see where we're going with that concept of the tree. Now, I may get a little scared at night going through the forest the way that you referenced it, but nonetheless, I imagine there must be several of those earlier blockers that we discussed that can get in the way of resolving conflict.
That's correct, man. And however, if you follow our 6-step process, you'll be on your way of better managing and resolving. And notice I've said throughout the podcast, it's managing and or resolving, Matt, because sometimes in life, we just have to manage the conflict. We're unable to resolve it, and that's okay. So we keep talking about managing and or resolving. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, so as we break down those 6 steps, we'll go one at a time and kind of work our way through each of those. Let's start with step 1, which is certainly critical, which is all about managing your emotions.
Absolutely, and this is the key. This is the key. Keep in mind that emotions are a result of the way we think. In one of our earlier podcasts on stress management, we've discussed a technique that helps people manage their emotion called reframing. Reframing your stinking thinking. And reframing is an excellent way to keep your emotions in check.
So could you walk us through that process once again? I think oftentimes people need to hear things a few times to really capture it.
Sure. Let's return to our earlier conflict about who was the best basketball player. As we both became frustrated and maybe even angry, I certainly was getting hyped up, because we were unable to convince one another who's right. And we both have some stinking thinking, if you would, going on in our head. And both of us may think that the other person is stubborn, maybe closed-minded, is the way they think about things. And with that thought, we begin to feel angry and frustrated. And so to reframe it is by rethinking that we have a right to our opinions. You have your beliefs and who you think is the better player, as do I. So we can respectfully agree to disagree. We're managing our conflict.
Well, you can respectively agree or disagree all you want. I still say MJ's the best player to ever hold.
No. It's the other way around. James is.
I'll get a hold of the edit room and we'll take care of that business before this podcast goes live. All joking aside, though, let's talk about steps 2 and 3, which are, as I understand it, really to identify our core beliefs and kind of get under the hood, if you will, or deeper into those roots more than we'd think.
Right. And this is, again, very important because it's critical to move off the branch level of our metaphoric tree and get down to the deep-rooted core beliefs. Each person has their core beliefs. So if we were in conflict, like we're pretending we are about the basketball players, it's important for you to understand my core beliefs and values around this particular conflict as it is vice versa. So we need to do it. And the best way to do that, as we talked about before the break, is perspective taking. And putting yourself, if I can put myself in your shoes, you can put yourself in my shoes, we're going to gain a better understanding of what my needs, my wants, my beliefs are, and vice versa.
So in my many years of both helping people within human resources and organizations, I oftentimes find that one of the critical keys to success, and I believe this is yet another step in our process, is helping individuals find common ground, where they can meet each other together to be able to really manage through that conflict and continue on that path of being as resilient as possible. Would you agree that that next step in the process is very much about common ground?
You're right, Mac. There's no question about it. Look, conflict exists because of the differences between people, not their similarities, but their differences. Therefore, it's really important to find the common ground with the person you're conflicted with, which really what you're doing is reducing the differences. And so by doing so, you're beginning to connect with that person. And we call that, there's a technique, what we call blending. Blending is any behavior which you reduce the differences between you and the person you're conflicted with in order to meet them where they're at. And we blend many different ways.
Well, give me a little bit more of an example of how blending could look in the workplace.
Okay, so we can blend visually, verbally, even our tone of voice, even with the words we use. So for example, picture one of your direct reports come to you, Matt, and they tell you about a serious car accident they were in, and their child is in the hospital. Tell me right now, pretend that's happening right now. What would happen to your voice? What would your voice sound like? Would it sound like, hey, tell me about your day? That was really, or would it sound more?
Well, I think it'd certainly be a softer tone. It would be an aspect of trying to demonstrate some form of empathy and actually applying some of those emotional and social intelligence skills that you and I have talked about in the past. But how does that in turn kind of help that conflict process?
Because see, we're connecting, we're blending, we're on the same tone, our same emotional level, and this is something that our neuroscience has taught us more recently, is that we automatically blend. We understand on some unconscious level the emotion of the other person, and we take that emotion on. And I think the key word you use is empathy. So you're empathically connecting with the other individual, thereby reducing differences between you two and creating that kind of psychological connection and bond with that person.
Okay, so step 5 and step 6, our final 2 steps, are very much about the solution. So step 5, identifying the solution, and step 6, really about those parties agreeing on the solutions. Take us through step 5 and 6 as we conclude that process.
Well, as you said, 5 and 6 is really the easy part. The more challenging parts is step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so step 5 is to identify the solution. This is a time where you and the person you're conflicted with, you brainstorm as many solutions as possible, but make sure that you don't evaluate the solution. Just list them. You may want to you probably want the other person to go first in creating the list. Once you've done that, step 6 is to agree on the solutions. Decide who needs to do what in order to achieve the agreed upon solution. If acceptable, document the action that each person will take. Be sure to follow a schedule up a follow-up meeting or discussion so you can see if your goals have been achieved.
Okay, so I'm glad that we had that opportunity to kind of walk through that 6-step process and really commit to our listeners about how you can come up with those practical solutions. The reality is, in order to be effective with regard to being resilient both as an individual and as an organization, you have to learn to overcome challenges. And conflict, first and foremost, is certainly one of those challenges. Once again, we hope you've enjoyed another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. We will see you at the next coffee break.